already in our first segment, our first part of our study of the encyclical letters of Pope St. John Paul II the Great, we saw how the central theme of his first encyclical letter, Redemptor Hominis, is that Jesus Christ is the center of the universe and of history. We also saw how that theme had been prepared in the life of Karol Wojtyła, the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, Poland, and how he had arrived in Rome with that theme already very much on his heart and in his mind. It was a theme, we saw further, that with his friend Henri de Lubac, the two had encountered at the Second Vatican Council, and how that theme had taken root in the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, entitled in Latin Gaudium et Spes. And it's exactly that point that I want to look a little bit further into in this segment of our study. John Paul II, as Karol Wojtyła, as the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, Poland, had attended the Second Vatican Council. And he had, with Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, and others, collaborated on the drafting and writing of Gaudium et Spes, that pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. That was a document that was very dear to the heart and mind of Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II. In fact, as Pope, he would refer to that document repeatedly. One scholar of the writing and work of John Paul II once remarked that if the Pope-mobile had a personalized license plate during the papacy of John Paul II, it would simply say GS 22, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22. Let's take a look at that paragraph, because it's precisely that paragraph that is the heart of Gaudium et Spes, and that is very much central to the teaching authority of John Paul II. That paragraph states this: in reality, it is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of humanity truly becomes clear. For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord. Christ, the new Adam, in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals humanity to itself and brings to light its very high calling. John Paul II discerned in the mystery of the Incarnation the truth that Jesus Christ became flesh. He came to earth to dwell among men. But in so doing, he did not only join himself to human nature, but he called to himself, for the purpose of deification and sanctification, all of human reality. And that is a theme to which he would turn many times as Pope. For example, in his encyclical letter Dominum et Vivificantem, and in many other places besides. But here, at the outset of his encyclical letters in Redemptor Hominis, he gives a note, he gives a tip of his hand to the Second Vatican Council. In the first chapter of that document, he notes that at the moment of his canonical election, he was very conscious of standing in the shadow of the Second Vatican Council, which had concluded its work in 1965. And he was also very conscious of the fact that he was to be the successor of John the 23rd, who convoked and convened the council, and Paul VI, who concluded it, as well as John Paul I, whose name showed deference to those two predecessors, John the 23rd and Paul VI. And so we might ask, sitting where we are in the early 21st century, whether the council was a fitting departure moment for the Pope. We're aware of the many interpretations of the council, some of which comport well with the authoritative teaching of the council, and others that get its fundamental teachings wrong. How, we might ask, can the council be trusted, and why might the council be a source of spiritual strength for John Paul II? Why might he look there at the beginning of his pontificate? Not too long into his papal ministry, he would call to his side a German bishop, and he would ask him to head up the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That man was Joseph Ratzinger. We know him today as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He would serve the church at the side of John Paul II for almost 2 decades. In a book-length interview that he delivered with his friend Vittorio Missori, Ratzinger reflects on the important role of the council. Much of what he said in that book-length interview was shared with his friend John Paul II. The two saw eye to eye on matters of the council. You can read the report or the interview that he did with Vittorio Missori. It's been published under the title The Ratzinger Report, an exclusive interview on the state of the church. There, Ratzinger, in conversation with Vittorio Missori, makes this important point. Today, no one who is and wishes to remain Catholic nourishes any doubts, nor can he nourish them, that the great documents of Vatican Council II are important, rich, opportune, and indispensable. But he offers a caveat. He knows that the conciliar documents can fall into the wrong hands and come to be misinterpreted. And so he says very clearly that the council documents need to be authoritatively interpreted. He notes, Vatican II and its official promulgations and its authentic documents cannot be held responsible for the developments, negative, after the council, which on the contrary radically contradict both the letter and the spirit of the council fathers. More to the point, perhaps, he says it is necessary to return to the authentic texts of the original Vatican II. And that is exactly what John Paul II is seeking to do in the beginning of his magisterial writing in Redemptor Hominis. He is seeking to recover an authentic, authoritative interpretation of the conciliar documents and to set the Church on the course of rightly understanding them. His papacy and the papacy that would follow his, that of Benedict XVI, would offer an authoritative interpretation of the council. Let us look at one other point that he makes in the book-length interview with Vittorio Missori. He notes in passing, in the conversation with Missori, that it is necessary to understand on theological grounds the council, and to recognize that if one rejects the council, one must therewith also reject all previous councils. If one accepts the council, one must therewith accept also all previous councils. Why? Because they derive from one and the same authority. Here's Vittorio Missori summarizing this aspect of the interview conversation with Ratzinger. Ratzinger drew 2 conclusions. First, it is impossible for a Catholic to take a position for Vatican II, but against Trent or Vatican I. Whoever accepts Vatican II as it has clearly expressed and understood itself, at the same time accepts the whole binding tradition of the Catholic Church, particularly also the 2 previous councils. And that also applies to the so-called progressivism, at least in the extreme forms. Second, it is likewise impossible to decide in favor of Trent and Vatican I, but against Vatican II. Whoever denies Vatican II denies the authority that upholds the other 2 councils, and thereby detaches them from their foundation. He goes on to make a very salient and wise and prudent observation, noting every partisan choice for or against the council, for this faction in the church or that faction in the church, destroys the whole, the very history of the church, which can exist only as an indivisible unity. Ecclesiologically, theologically, Ratzinger, John Paul II would say the same thing. Understand the church as one, precisely because with St. Paul, the church is understood as the body of Christ, and Christ himself is one. Christ unites in his one person divinity and humanity. If Christ is one, the body, which is Christ, must also be one. And the church, being this body, cannot just be one at one point in history and not one at another point in time. It must be one throughout. And therefore, to fully embrace the church, which is the body of Christ, we must embrace her whole history, which includes her history today, which includes also the Second Vatican Council. And if that is the case, it is a fitting point that John Paul II anchor his pontifical ministry and his proclamation about the Redeemer of man in the writings, in the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. That council would give to John Paul II an important gift that he would treasure throughout his papal ministry, and that is the normative ecclesiology of the council. Normative because it is authoritative and genuine, it is truly orthodox. Ecclesiology, the study of the Church, which John Paul II would receive from the Second Vatican Council, therefore, was a proper understanding of the Church, not as a plaything of politics, ecclesial or otherwise, but rather as the very body of Christ that rules through history. It is to this normative ecclesiology that we will turn in a subsequent segment of our course of studies, and it is exactly this point with which John Paul II will conclude the first chapter of Redemptor Omnis.